Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So as I'm trying to cover quite a lot in 5 minutes, I'm just going to jump quickly into the definitions of the key terms we will be discussing today. So can we go on the next slide, or yeah, the next one? So a peace process can be understood as a formal attempt to bring political and/or military protagonists of conflict to some sort of mutual agreement as how to end the conflict. A peace agreement can be understood as a formal, publicly available document produced after discussion with conflict protagonists and mutually agreed to by some or all of them addressing conflict with a view to ending it. A drug provision is just any reference to drugs, its trade and trafficking within an agreement. So in terms of the key trends, can we go on the next slide? Already. We see that out of 1,868 peace agreement, that 78 that has been signed over the last 30 years, 78 agreements contain provisions that relate to drugs. So this is quite a small proportion, is around 4% of them. Still, what I'm trying to highlight here is the wide diversity in how those different provisions are articulating issues of drugs. So the first point I'm trying to highlight with this pie chart here is how the strengths of commitments being quite different. So you can see that more than half of them are just making a very general reference to drugs, while 28 agreements are making a more specific reference to a mechanism that will address drugs issues, and only 6 of them have strong commitments with an enforceable mechanism to address them. Those 6 peace agreements are part of the process related to conflicts in Colombia, Afghanistan, and Yemen. In my next slides, what I'm trying to highlight is the key trends in terms of the wording of those agreements. So first of all, we can see that there are different types of commitments. So if you wonder why all those slides are not adding up to 78, it's because not all of those agreements are actually making commitments or addressing the framing of drugs or measures, as I explained in the next slides. So, for example, within 42 peace agreements, the parties are committing to commit to narco-trafficking, 9 agreements to combat consumption, and to lower extents to prevent the dangers of narcotics or to not raise funds through it. This said, you can still see that those 4 types of commitment are still quite aligned to the global war on drugs. Still, if you look into the more specific, so if you see that in the next slide, if you look at the more specific type of language that is used to frame the issue of drugs, according to what we could expect to see, we see that actually the most regular way to define drugs is as an issue of development. And here, as you can see, 24 agreements are defining drugs as an issue related to poverty or agriculture, 15 as a threat to the economy, and equally 15 as a security terrorist threat. And to a lower extent, drugs are also seen as a health, corruption, environmental, or democratic issue. Finally, in the next slides, you can see how there is even further diversity in the type of measure. So of course, we could talk much longer into the different measures that are being considered, but what I'm just trying to highlight is how there is no one way to deal or to address drugs issues within those processes and the negotiations leading to those agreements. So if you just look at the 4 top of them, you can see that one of the most regular ways to think of how to approach drugs issues is through the regional and international cooperation, or through alternative agriculture, to the reduction of production, or to collaboration with law enforcement of police forces. What is quite interesting as well is how other processes and agreements have been much more creative by making reference to the restoration of the ecosystem, by just calling for the integration of drugs in the forthcoming peace talks, or to design a drug policy. And so among all those processes, what is quite important to keep in mind is that how, like, the diversity and of those elements, and we're going to look much more closely in the next slide in the very specific process of Colombia. So Colombia is one of the longest and most ambitious peace processes that has been addressing drugs issues. So out of the 128 agreements that have been signed over the past 30 years, so the last one being signed in 2017, 20 of those are containing provisions related to drugs. Still, only 2 of those 20 agreements have very, very substantive provision related to drugs. The first one being the agreement signed in 2014 between the Colombian government and the FARC, so the solution to the problem of illegal drugs. And because of the structure and the process in which the peace process between the FARC and the Colombian government was arranged, each of key themes have been negotiated as a separate agreement and then all renegotiated and agreed as a whole in the final peace agreement. So as much as the 2014 is one of the most substantive partial agreement that deal with drugs, the 2016 one is just like it is the most substantive and comprehensive peace agreement of all times in all countries. So it's an agreement that is more than 300 pages, and it covers very wide and important issues along drugs issues such as the rural reform, democracy and political participation, security reforms, transitional justice and policies for victims, as well as implementation and verification. So I leave it to my colleague not to give more explanation of this specific process. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Astrid. That's great. We'll pass now to Francisco Gutierrez to hear a little bit more about the challenges and trade-offs around drugs in the Colombian peace process. And then when Francisco has finished, there will be a 5-minute interval to ask clarification questions of both Astrid and Francisco. So over to you, Francisco.
So first of all, hi to everybody. Good to see you, particularly Mariano. Good to see you again. But of course, also to all. So Karen raised 3 points that I had to speak about. So I will go in order through those 3 points and see how they pan out. They pan out. The first point is the broad contours of the Colombian peace process and the international role in it, and also mentioning my own role. So it was supposed that the Colombian was the only standing civil war in the Western Hemisphere, so it gathered massive international support, actually much more than nationally, where opinions were very much divided. My role was quite marginal. I simply provided input for the High Peace Commissioner on land and other issues, but particularly on land, and then was a member of the Commission for the History of the Conflict and its Victims, summoned by the peace table at La Habana. So the final agreement has those 6 points Astrid just spoke about: comprehensive rural reform, political participation, end of the conflict, solution of the illicit drugs, victims, and implementation and verification. And there was a comprehensive notion advanced by the High Peace Commissioner, which was territorial peace. So this issue of the borderlands, and particularly unequal regional development, was very much at the center, at least of the public discourse around peace. The illicit drugs agreement set up a large-scale illicit crop substitution program called PNIS, PNIS, which involved between 100 and 150,000 people. The count varies according to the criteria, because this program involved individuals, families, and communities, so perhaps even more people. And it had both important innovations and continuities with respect to past substitution programs launched in the context of other peace and/or counterinsurgent activities. And it, let's say, thinking about this international support, it also counted with UN ODC follow-up. The PNIS started to be implemented in May 2017 amidst multiple problems: lack of coordination by state agencies, inability to provide the goodies, fatal events, massacres, etc. But in 2018, the political party that had been attacking very strongly the peace agreement won the elections and came into power. And it claimed that it would continue implementing the peace accords. Independently of the credibility of this claim, of course, this is a different discussion. I think it can be shown that the present government has walked back massively from its commitments with respect to coca growers and the PNIS. We can speak about this, but I think there's strong evidence about that. We have published this on this in detail. In economic, political, and also legal terms. Furthermore, the government has launched a major campaign of manual eradication and reinstituted aerial fumigations, which had been suspended by the previous government. These fumigations are still not scheduled, but they are in the political agenda. I have to say that in the context of the Drugs and Disorder Project, we implemented in 2019 a survey on the pennies among coca growers. And in March, we will repeat it. So we will have kind of the perceptions and reported realities regarding the pennies at the beginning and at the end. And this will be very interesting. Second point, a brief overview of the key challenges and trade-offs around drugs in the conflict-affected borderlands and how they relate to the design and implementation of the peace process and the broader war to peace transition. So the pennies was built over 4 correct assumptions. I believe they were correct. So first, narco trafficking is a huge problem for the country. However, this may seem obvious, but of course the question is, are you issuing policies for the whole problem or only for illicit crops? In this case, it was focused basically on illicit crops. So there you have a first source of problems. Second, coca growers are a very important constituency. Third, there is a connection between illicit crops and access to land. So it was supposed that the first point, the point on land and the point on crop substitution would be intimately linked. This was at the very heart of the design of both points. And there was also a key territorial dimension, linked to precarity, lack of infrastructure. A lot of economists have made analysis of regional development in Colombia and have come to the conclusion that regional inequality in Colombia has been growing instead of being reduced. And these were themes that came into the peace agreement very explicitly. At the same time, the pennies and the peace agreement was unable or unwilling to develop a more nuanced understanding of the place of illicit crops in the Colombian agrarian world. I think that would be my evaluation. So to say it in a sentence, it took for exceptional what was normal, and as normal what was exceptional. So the idea that was that coca involved violence, etc., and was linked to war, and that was supposed to be exceptional. But in reality, the relationship of the Colombian state with its expanding agrarian frontiers has been, for more than a century, extraordinarily traumatic. This has been documented in detail, besides we have our 8 million IDPs, the majority of which are peasants. And indeed, if coca has been associated to several forms of brutal violence and territorial takeover by non-state armed groups, this is not terribly new, and one could speak about other agrarian economies that stand perhaps even in a worse position with respect to coca. What was new really regarding coca is the type of rural world associated to it, and also to marijuana. I have to say, though, illicit marijuana has been dramatically reduced in the country. We have a small but booming legal marijuana sector, but this is a wholly different issue. So the problem of coca crops is not only their profitability. Certainly coca has not made peasants rich, but it has created a viable small tenant rural economy for different reasons that of course I don't have time to go into now, but I think this can be proven as well. So it also gave origin to a rural middle class and allowed the semblance of upward social mobility. It also guaranteed this for labor. Coca and marijuana are highly labor intensive, unlike many other key legal rural economies like palm oil, etc., cattle ranching, whatnot. So besides, if we are thinking in territorial and regional terms, coca had generated massive positive spillovers and externalities over regional economies. Think about small shopkeepers, etc. For example, you go to Putumayo, and this is an economy fed very much by these small shopkeepers that take goods from across the border, they sell it, etc. This economy is fed very much by coca. And once again, we hardly have a legal alternative with these characteristics. So it's not only profitability. And I have to add that coca production is also not necessarily, as has been depicted sometimes, the epicenter of massive disorder or permanent disarray, among other things because it gave origin to a rural middle class. And as all the middle classes in the world, when they have some surplus, they start to invest in education for their children, purchasing fixed assets like motorcycles, etc., and investing in real estate and land. So to avoid any misunderstanding, I am not claiming that this economy is a utopia or a phalanstery. It has many terrible things. What I am highlighting is that it has some aspects that were not addressed in the thinking about the problem, and that actually depend on the crop being illegal. So we have, between commas, good outcomes for the wrong reasons. But this is a situation that starkly interrogates Colombian society and Colombian peace agreement. So where is the trade-off? Let's say at the micro level, one could say that cocaleros can have access to a viable livelihood, upward social mobility, etc., at the cost of being targeted by the states, starting with the state, but also by non-state actors with fumigations and violence. And for the country, it is seeing how an illegal crop creates social realities that a very violent pro-legal agrarian economy has not been able to create. So this should have motivated a more complex reflection on what territorial peace meant and what the necessary transition from illegal crops to legal economies should have meant. A last comment on this point before going to the third one is that peasants, we have seen this through surveys and in-depth interviews and simply informal conversations. Coca peasants are basically fed up of illegality and they want to make the transition. This even corresponds to a certain economic rationale. If you have some savings, you start to be more risk averse, etc., etc. So the question is how to produce the conditions for the transition. The real existed alternative development, and in this sense, PENIS was completely aligned with the Colombian tradition, assumes that the way to do this is through a combination of sticks, basically fumigations and heavy-handed state violence, and carrots, like subsidies, provision of public goods, etc., etc. But the assumption was basically wrong. First of all, because it did not consult the peasant's state of mind. The sticks got in the way of the carrots, as my colleagues Camilo Acero and Diana Machuca demonstrated in detail. The Colombian state has historically been much better at providing sticks than carrots. And besides, fumigation is a political and a social disaster. So actually this triggers not only social, but also territorial odium against the political authorities. And it is perceived, and this is a territorial focal point. It is perceived as literally an invasion by the state center, and this perception has fed into political violence and can continue to do so. So I go for the third point. So Karen says a reflection on how peace processes can become more aware of the challenges and trade-offs around drugs in conflict-affected borderlands, and in short, what could have been done differently. So first, a disclaimer, I am not a decision maker, so for sure I have problems to answer this question. But let's say trying to wear some policy lenses, I would say the following. The PENIS leaves several very positive and important precedents, but at the same time, it suffered severe problems from the beginning. And I think the evaluation has to be done very carefully. I think the patrimony or the legacy it leaves is very important. At the same time, its shortcomings are becoming with time more and more obvious. I would say my five takeaways would be the following. First of all, politics is crucial for any serious crop substitution effort. So I am not indulging here in the jeremiads which all academics, the first one, me, including me, love about policy being not only technical, but rather pointing. Yeah, so it's not about the technical, it's about the political. Actually, what the experience of the Penis shows is that technical issues are extremely important. The amount of the lack of expertise and the lack of precision in the implementation of Penis was a disaster. But I'm rather pointing to a very specific issue. Drugs production and consumption affect directly people's lives, and they are thus very high in the political agenda. So any serious alternative development program will need time and at the same time trigger political pushbacks. So policymakers would do well to ask themselves from the beginning, how can I buy time for the program? These issues will not disappear with a magic wand, the assumption, waving a magic wand, the assumption that this problem would disappear in 2 or 3 regions was quite happy-go-lucky. And as you see in Colombia, basically the triumph of punitive coalitions in parallel in Colombia and the United States seriously undercut the viability of the Penis. So here we have a directly political question that has not been addressed, to the best of my knowledge, by let's say the people working on this area. Second, if crop substitution is to be linked to agrarian transformation, it probably should be concentrated on a single agency with broad powers, have bureaucratic muscle, and be able to incorporate local authorities. Though coordination issues, which have been proverbially difficult for the Colombian state, were a disaster for the Penis from the very beginning, and the assumption, let's say the underlying assumption, was that we could have a light agency to solve a problem that actually all decision makers in the Colombian state said that that was hugely important. So they were trying to solve with a very light solution a problem that they said that was historical, very complicated, and a national security issue, as they said, literally. Third, the state will have to overcome very deep distrust, and especially after the Penis. So there was, in this process, there has been a massive destruction of whatever trust and confidence remain in the states. I have to say that substitution leaders are being assassinated already by the tens, and maybe in the future reels will be by the hundreds. So they are being assassinated systematically without a semblance of provision of security. So this amounts to a sort of carnage by invitation, in which you tell people to participate in a program and then don't provide security for them. I think there are some, here we have to be imaginative, and there are some possible solutions to this in terms of provision of security for leaders, also of overcoming mistrust, maybe even the insurance scheme for peasants. Why not? I think that here we can exercise a little bit of imagination to give guarantees to the peasants that participate in future programs. Fourth, I think that the voice of the peasants has to be fully incorporated into the discussion. The Penis implementation has been massively exclusionary. I think the Penis design started with a step in the good direction, legalizing the cocalero and marijuana social organizations, not only the national one, but many others in the regions. But then this voice has been systematically stigmatized and sidelined. And the fifth, very simple conclusion is that the overlap, and I'm already ending, Karen. I think I have still 2 or 3 minutes. The overlap between fumigation and voluntary substitution is not constructive, but massively destructive for any substitution program linked to peace. So as I said above, the peasants want to make the transit, but this is not a question so much of combining carrots and sticks, but precisely posing the correct territorial questions and taking seriously this term of territorial peace. So I think peasants should and could be empowered and incorporated to decision-making in a framework of gradual transit to legality and economic transformation. And maybe if Colombians do not take the first step because they feel that the political costs would be too high or whatnot, perhaps US and European governments or international agencies could start with this and start to speak with them, because I think this is absolutely necessary to produce any kind of sensible program. And the other aspect, the other side of the coin, is that state presence through aerial fumigation. So state formation through aspersion is not sustainable. And it's not sustainable through, from a human rights perspective, definitely, this is more or less obvious. It is not sustainable from a democratic perspective, despite Colombia being a rather conservative society, and for example, supporting many punitive measures against drugs. However, the opinion polls I know show that there is a quite strong majority against fumigation in the country, but the government against democratic principles has not been responsive, and it has imposed it anyways. But I would say that also from a hawkish, tough political authority perspective, the overlap of fumigation and substitution also does not work. This boils down to a venerable and powerful idea that I think was issued by no one and no less than Machiavelli, basically according to which your methods to govern must be compatible with the incentive that people have to reproduce their conditions of subsistence. And if you are not able to guarantee this basic, then you are due to a really rough ride. And I think that Colombians have experienced this, or we have experienced this in our own skin for several decades, and this might continue. So that would be that, Karen.
Thank you very much, Francisco. I'd like to invite Dipali Mukhopadhyay from the US Institute of Peace, senior expert working on the Afghan peace process, to share some of her perspectives on the challenges and trade-offs around drugs in the Afghanistan peace process from an international viewpoint. So Dipali, over to you.
Thanks so much, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here. I've learned so much about this topic over the years from several folks on this in this conversation, particularly Jonathan Goodhand. So I'm really glad to be here. I should say that I'm coming at this. I'm currently doing work with the U.S. Institute of Peace, but I'm coming at this really primarily from an academic point of view, from having worked as a student of Afghanistan for the last 2 decades. But it's been a very interesting experience for me the last 6 months to come into the U.S. Institute of Peace, which has been working on Afghanistan for the last 2 decades, but in particular working on the peace process, in close proximity to several of the key players in both on the U.S. government side, but also on the Afghan government and civil society side. And so I'll just start by saying that one of the most striking things to me is that there's actually not a lot of discussion about narcotics or counter-narcotics that I pick up on in US circles concerned with Afghanistan these days, which stands in very stark contrast with my sense of the zeitgeist, even about a decade ago, during which time counter-narcotics was seen as essential as a theme, as a cross-cutting topic that came up in basically every discussion, regardless of what sector, or topic was of primary concern. So, that's alarming on the one hand, given that Afghanistan continues to contribute in unparalleled terms to the opium economy. But for some of the reasons that I think Francisco outlined in the Colombian case, perhaps it's for the best, given the limited dividends, I think, that were yielded from an enormous amount of attention and expense that was focused on the project of countering narcotics. My own, perspective on this developed initially about 10, 12 years ago when I began doing fieldwork in Afghanistan on subnational governance. And I began to understand counter-narcotics in that context as providing a really interesting set of opportunities to a number of key stakeholders in Afghanistan and in the West. In the beginning, my understanding of the project of counter-narcotics was really through the lens of state building and conceiving of it as an instrument of state building, a means for Afghan government elites in particular to demonstrate control, to demonstrate capacity, and to demonstrate commitment in these very, easily visualized, quantifiable terms. I also understood it from the subnational perspective as a means of performing loyalty to Kabul, but also a means of earning goodwill and, in fact, material benefits from the international community, that it was understood as one of the opportunities by which to do that. Those goodies then in turn meant that, whether it was something called the Good Performance Fund, or there were several different incentives for performing counter-narcotics, that it then became a source of patronage like other forms of aid and income did, and a kind of rent that could be accrued, not unlike other forms of rent. As I kind of dug deeper into it and engaged with the work of folks like Jonathan, but also Adam Payne, David Mansfield, it became clear to me that this kind of instrumentalizing of a drug policy as part of state building really revealed the predatory, depriving, and coercive aspects of state building that could kind of hide behind a policy which was considered socially beneficial as a function, of Islam and the idea that drugs are haram, but that in fact it was incredibly problematic for cultivators when their crops were eradicated close to the time of harvest, that in fact, there were many ways in which elites further up the chain were able to continue profiting. And so those aspects of governance became clear through the lens of counter-narcotics. What also became clear was this was a way for international organizations and donor countries to perform a kind of problem solving that situated the drug problem as something far away, that was a supply issue, and allowed for the deferral of taking responsibility for what seemed like an unending Western demand. And it also, for Westerners, became a means of identifying the good guys, so-called, not unlike the ways in which counterterrorism and more kinetic forms of activity did that, and glossed over then the complex political economic realities that surrounded drug cultivation and trafficking. So much of this was neither laudable nor desirable, and I think that in that sense it makes me not unhappy that a lot of this conversation has moved to the margins, right? What I'm watching for in terms of the role of narcotics and counter-narcotics now, as the negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government continue, there are a few things I'm looking at. One, as the Taliban make the case for retaking power, most aspects of their rule are understood as, very reprehensible and unpopular. One of the things that will be interesting to see will be the degree to which they will revisit their own approach to counter-narcotics. And will that actually create a possibility for agreement, even cooperation with Western donors? Will that become a source of rent extraction for the Taliban, a value proposition that they might offer in terms of their ostensible ability to control cultivation and trafficking. The second thing that will be interesting to look at will be any process of demobilization of combatants. After 2001, it was impossible to study ex-combatants and mid-level commanders and senior commanders, or warlords as they were called, without looking at the narcotics economy, but also without looking at the counter-narcotics and the kind of racketeering that we associate often with early state formation of, you know, the drug traffickers becoming the police, and the complexities of what security sector reform, reintegration look like when you have this set of armed actors now moving from the shadows into the semi-shadows, or maybe even to the formal state and private sector. Will this at the higher levels be, will the profits from narcotics, but also the possibilities of rent that come with counter-narcotics activities, become one more source of rent that might serve as a lubricant for a new kind of limited access order in Afghanistan that includes the Taliban? That's another thing that will be of interest to me. And then finally, I would say, you know, will donors take this peace process and the possibility, remote as it feels at the moment, of a post-peace agreement Afghanistan, to revisit the question of counter-narcotics as a project of intervention? Is it a relic of the early 2000s? And might there be an opportunity to think about this in a new, more productive, more constructive way? Might instead the idea of the kind of much longer processes that are not really amenable to quick results and to, you know, easy wins that come with improved security, that come with infrastructure development, that come with regional economic integration, might those actually become more sustainable means and longer term means that involves a shift in the donor mindset from the ways in which these questions were approached in the first post-conflict period after 2001. And the last thing I'll just say is that while the discussion of counter-narcotics has, I think, receded to the margins in the US, the focus on the opioid crisis has not receded. And the conversation, I think, has become appropriately more centered in a discussion about the American political economy and the social context that produces the demand for these drugs in the first place. And I think that's also a welcome correction.
I'd like to move now to Jasmine Bhatia, who is currently with the European Institute of Peace, but was formerly on the Afghanistan team of drugs and disorder. And to offset what we've just heard from Dipali about a kind of international view with a borderland view of the challenges and trade-offs around drugs in the Afghanistan peace process. So over to you, Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. It's very good to see everyone again. I am here in Afghanistan, in Kabul, doing this presentation, so apologies if the internet is a little bit wonky. I'm hoping it won't be. Just to introduce myself for those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Jasmine Bhatia. As Karen mentioned, I currently work for the European Institute of Peace. Right now, our project is working in support of the Afghan government, primarily the State Ministry for Peace and the High Council for National Reconciliation, as well as the negotiation team, on providing support for the Afghanistan peace process. And as also Karen mentioned, until last year, I was working on the Drugs and Disorder Project on the Afghanistan research. So what I was thinking to do for this presentation is talk a little bit about our work in the borderlands of Afghanistan and the Drugs and Disorder Project. And then I'll move on to some reflections about illicit economies and where it might fit in the peace process that's currently underway in Afghanistan. So just to start with a little bit of context, the Drugs and Disorder Project in Afghanistan really focuses on that relationship between violence, drugs, and development in 3 border regions, Nangarhar in the east, Nimroz in the west, and Badakhshan in the north. So these three borderland provinces have a lot in common, in particular cross-border trade and the importance of that trade. And all of these three provinces are areas which are historically quite dependent on this trade. And this trade, of course, includes many things, including illicit drugs. But there's also a lot of variation between these three borderlands. So Nangarhar, for example, has historically been strategically influential and quite important politically. For example, it's a place where the Afghan monarchy spent its winters in the past. So it's long received a disproportionate amount of resources and political attention. So Nimrose in the southwest is comparatively a remote and historically under-resourced province. So, even in terms of research, there was very little prior work that we could draw from and build upon in this project. But Nimrose is really interesting in that it's a borderland that's currently in transition. Its main city, Zaranj, its capital, has emerged as an increasingly important trading hub with Iran. It's also, a hub of illicit activity, including the smuggling of drugs, and has also emerged in recent years as a key people smuggling hub in Afghanistan. So as a result, the city is going through a process of transformation. This brings new economic opportunities and inward migration, but also increased inequality and more competition from power brokers over resources and trading networks. And finally, we have Badakhshan, which is a province on the northern border of Afghanistan, which is also geographically remote from Kabul, but during the last 40 years of conflict has been strategically important for the flow of illicit goods, which includes weapons, drugs, gemstones, and many other commodities. And it's also a province with some of the highest rates of drug consumption in Afghanistan. So these are kind of the three areas that we were focused on in our research. So now to link that to the peace process that's ongoing, what I can do is start by giving some additional context from the vantage point of here on the ground in terms of how things are going. So the perspective here on the ground is that the peace process as it's currently going is stalling quite badly. The levels of violence in our borderlands and also in Kabul is currently very high. It's also the case that the peace process, and this is, I think, quite an important point, it's felt or perceived as something that's quite detached from ordinary people across the country. It's perceived as more of an elite-driven project. As far as our research at EIP shows, and other organizations, there's not much understanding by people across the country as to even what's going on, what's the status of negotiations, what is being negotiated, what the trade-offs are. I mean, there's really not a lot of public discussion about this at all. And again, it just contributes to this feeling of detachment across the country in terms of how this peace process is being constructed. One other challenge that the government has, it's notable that in areas that are fully Taliban controlled, security is quite good comparatively if we look at the comparison between Taliban controlled areas in full and contested areas or government controlled areas. And the Taliban controlled areas are places where you see a lot of people who are able to cultivate and trade in illicit drugs, but many other commodities in safety and security. And so life in those areas at the moment, in many of those areas, not all, but in many of those areas, is almost preferable to life in a government controlled area, even in provincial capitals, even in district centers at this point. And the other issue that's kind of dominating these talks at the moment is that there are major political divisions in the country which are affecting the status of the negotiations as well as the functioning of the government entirely. And of course, these are particularly divisions between the two major factions in government, which are the Ghani and Abdullah camps. So at the moment, the government, what that adds up to is the government is very much on the back foot, and the negotiations in Doha are currently stalled. The Taliban are in a position where they are able to make a lot of demands without necessarily signaling that they're willing to compromise. And as a result, the prediction this year is, by a lot of observers, is that violence will continue to increase substantively perhaps putting the peace process at risk. So it's a little bit of a peace process that's now in flux and perhaps in danger of going backwards into an increase in instability and large-scale violence. So in terms of illicit drugs and conflict, when we're looking at the government's major trade-offs, what can they do? So in the government and also in some places in the international community, there is a widespread belief and perception, which is largely accurate, that the illicit economy and particularly illicit drugs are a major source of funding for the Taliban. And one of the reasons they're able to recruit, they're able to fight, they're able to replenish themselves so effectively. They're also able to use these to, for example, pay off the families of Taliban fighters for anyone who is deceased. So they're using these funds to challenge the government more effectively. So if you talk to people in the security circles, in particular in the government or international community, there's still a belief that by cutting off this funding, the Taliban would be more likely to negotiate in good faith and make the necessary compromises at the negotiation table that they're not currently able or willing to make. On the other hand, as many people already have described, in these border areas and indeed across the country, illicit drugs are deeply embedded in local economies. The illicit drug economy is perhaps the largest and most lucrative industry in Afghanistan. By some accounts, it provides jobs and incomes to over 1 million people. So it would be difficult to take substantial counter-narcotics initiatives without damaging the economic livelihoods and human security of its own citizens. And indeed, this threatens the legitimacy of the Afghan government. And we can see evidence of this over the past 20 years, during which time the international community has invested a lot in counter-narcotics initiatives. And as Dipali has described, the initial thinking, the initial focus was much more energetic, much more focus on forced eradication. But this policy was very unpopular and has the impact or the consequence of turning a lot of the public away from the government, creating an opportunity for the Taliban. And this dynamic still exists today. So I think now I agree with Dipali that the consensus has really changed in the government, that forced eradication policies are really counterproductive. They weaken the government's position. But softer policies such as alternative livelihoods have also proved ineffective in terms of reducing Taliban access to illicit funds, et cetera. So the government's hands are really tied at the moment, or at least they feel quite paralyzed in what they can achieve in the short term in terms of dealing with or grappling with this issue of illicit economy. Another factor, of course, is that many people in the government benefit from illicit economies as well. At the local level, we observe a lot of cooperation between insurgents and government actors. And of course, this relationship also between illicit economies and violence is not always as simple or clear as it seems. So for example, in Nangarhar, our research showed that Daesh or Islamic State forces took a very hard line, much harder than the government, in fact, and enforced complete drug eradication in their territories. And so it's not always the case that violent actors and the illicit drug economy go hand in hand. I think it's a lot more complicated if you look at the borderland areas and the local level. So I think I'll just quickly wrap up. What can the Afghan government do now? What are the policy options that are maybe open to them in these negotiations? So there are perhaps 3 different strategies they could pursue. One is to follow the Colombian example and go for more of a explicit policy of suppression, perhaps mixed with some financial incentives. However, as we've already described, the drug economy is so embedded in Afghan society at this time. There's so much insecurity that it's likely to be ineffective, particularly in the short term, and quite unpopular. And so there doesn't seem to be, at least this is my impression at the moment, a lot of appetite to do this or to pursue this option. There may be a little bit more appetite to try and negotiate for the implementation or the inclusion of softer measures or commitments towards illicit economies. So these could include, for example, reaching an agreement with the Taliban to carry out public education or public health campaigns related to drug use, perhaps some alternative livelihoods programs. This may be possible as an interim measure in particular, but of course, enforcement of this may be an issue, and it doesn't necessarily address the government's concern about the Taliban being funded by illicit economies. And finally, they could choose to simply exclude this issue from the peace process and just make it, an issue that's addressed in other forums. This may be easier in the short term. It may make the process more streamlined, but it doesn't necessarily, again, address any of these key trade-offs. The other factor is there may be international pressure for both parties to make some kind of commitment to reducing illicit drugs as part of a negotiated settlement. We haven't heard much about this yet from the US or from any international sources, but if we do reach a point at where negotiations actually do progress and we start to talk about these issues, there may be some pressure to include this internationally, at least some commitment for a reduction of illicit drugs. So it's not clear yet, as this is still kind of early days in the process, as to whether or not that's going to be possible. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be a high priority either for the international community or for the Afghan government, but this may change in the future. And finally, in terms of just looking at this peace process from a borderland perspective, I think there is a growing recognition and a growing frustration that this process at present is very exclusive. And there are efforts to make the peace process more participatory, to bring borderland voices into the process. There's a lot of work to do, and a lot of things are not happening right now. But there are organizations that are doing some work, and I think USIP actually is one of the organizations that's quite engaged at the local level to talk about the peace process, and there are other organizations as well. But the main thing and the main concern of, I think, most Afghans living here at the moment is that violence is at such high levels, and there's so much uncertainty that is, the top concern of everyone in the country right now. And there's just very little prospect of reducing illicit economies at the moment. So in terms of tackling this issue in the current peace process at this time, I don't think there's a lot of space for that, but we'll see as the negotiations progress. So I can stop there, but happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. Adding to Pali's presentation, I think a really nuanced picture of what some of the dilemmas are and some of the difficulties of challenging illicit drugs at this point in the peace process. To hear now from Charles Petrie, former UN Assistant Secretary General, former Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Myanmar, to reflect based on his past experience about the challenges and trade-offs around drugs in Myanmar peace processes from an international perspective. So, Charles, over to you. You're muted.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good. Sorry. In terms of addressing the topic itself, there are others in the group, Jean-Luc Lemayeux and Tom Kramer, who are much better positioned to do so. Because when I was the UN coordinator in Myanmar from 2003 to the end of 2007, Jean-Luc was the head of UNODC, and Tom very much at the forefront of drawing attention to the issue. My experience of illicit economies and peace processes has had more to do with Eastern DRC or the DRC itself, and then later in the context of the ceasefires in Myanmar. From August 1998 to August 2001, I was the senior UN official responsible for initiating and maintaining contacts with the different rebel movements in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. And it is in this capacity that I developed insights into the criminalization of economies. I was able to observe how ruthless individuals could manipulate and transform manageable, relatively harmless interethnic tensions into violent confrontations, in the process displacing or consuming local and traditional authority in order to maintain a state of unrest that in turn gave them unimpeded access to the riches of the area. These economic strongmen were able to establish and preserve control over these resources through the forced displacement of populations, the exorbitant taxation of their own people, the destruction and burning of crops, and the massacre of those who dared to return. It could be argued that in the growing number of areas of the DRC, violence and instability have reached levels of easily sustainable economic equilibrium or self-perpetuation. Underlying the establishment of such an equilibrium is the emergence of alternative, non-traditional criminal power structures and the corresponding disempowerment of traditional and to some extent accountable community leadership. With hindsight, I realized that our attempts to fulfill the humanitarian mandates actually provoked greater violence. The level and strength of the pushback was directly proportionate to the nature of the value of the assistance provided, the threat posed by the possible empowerment of local community and traditional leadership, and the level of political ambition of these new power structures. At the time, I developed a mental map of the violence that helped me try to understand the people I was engaging with. The map was basically a spectrum defined at one end by economic interest and at the other political ambition. I placed individual interlocutors along my mental line depending on the nature of their self-interest. So one extreme of the spectrum, towards the greed side, I placed groups or individuals with little regard for the needs of the local inhabitants. I defined them as bandits or asset depleters, groups that had relatively short-term time horizons and saw the maximization of profit at all cost. Maintaining a state of instability and violence through the flagrant manipulation of interethnic differences was their preferred mode of displacing traditional authority. The environment created by the actions of such groups was inherently unstable and extremely volatile. These were the players most threatened by the reemergence of traditional power structures. Next along the spectrum were the individual or groups who had had the time and ability to displace, eliminate, buy off, or even co-opt traditional authority. They were no longer as dependent on the need to maintain a state of volatility and instability to remain in control. These players established a mafia type of control of the local wealth without attempting to control the local population. With little or no interest in any form of governments, legitimization was obtained through the ability to access international markets. The key difference between the mafia type actors and the next category that I called commanders was the latter's dependence on a stable workforce to exploit the resources under their control. In this case, there was a need to engage with local populations. Thus, the commanders created a workforce from among the local population or forcibly imported labor from elsewhere. They established their dominance through armed elements personally loyal to them. Generally, these commanders controlled and defended limited areas. Encountered a step further along the axis was the first set of players seeking to establish constituencies that were wider than localized interests. While continuing to benefit from the exploitation of local resources, these leaders or warlords were even more interested in the longer sustainability of their presence through some form of obtention of varying levels of acceptability from the local population. Such relationships were for the most part built along ethnic lines. From that point on in my mental map, I entered the realm of politics, politicians, and patronage, a completely different kettle of fish. But I fear I've strayed slightly off track. I am some ways away from the topic of drugs and disorder. I'm not sure drugs actually fit into my model. Maybe they do, in as much as poppy cultivation is such a fundamental component of local economic activity in the areas where it is grown. But from the experience of facilitating dialogue between the armed groups and the Tatmadaw in Myanmar during the period 2012 to 2015, it was very clear to see how the production and distribution of methamphetamines could be part of a military subjugation strategy of the population in armed ethnic areas. Tom highlighted very early on the impact of drugs on the populations in the central part of Shan State. I saw similar attempts in the areas under the control of the Newmont State Party. The whole issue of illicit economic activity was a blind spot in the Myanmar peace process. While the question of illicit drugs was mentioned in the nation's wide ceasefire agreement. The whole issue of illicit economies was actually considered to be the too hard portion of the ceasefires. Those of us involved in facilitating the implementation of the ceasefires knew that this was the monster that had yet to be disturbed. The recent coup in Myanmar is incredibly stupid. The Tatmadaw had it all, and they have thrown it away to support the political ambitions of their commander. I don't think the Tatmadaw understands how uncharted the path it has embarked on actually is. They probably think that they are just turning to their old playbook without realizing how precarious the economy is, and that social media and the examples of popular protests throughout the world since 2012 are game changers for Myanmar. The military may have opened a Pandora's box. The people are not as easily cowed into submission by the military as they once were. And most importantly, the criminals who control local economies could very well decide to exploit the situation to further their local domination. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charles. First, for sharing your mental map, which was fascinating, and also for those comments on the current situation in Myanmar. I'd like to turn now to Pat Meehan, who leads the research team on Myanmar for drugs and disorder, to hear a little bit more about a borderland view of drugs in the Myanmar peace process. So over to you, Pat.
Okay, hi everyone. The point where Charles finished his talk is very much where I want to begin. And I'll give a little bit of background of where we work in Myanmar and then come on to that. So our work in Myanmar focuses on two states, Kachin State and Shan State, in the country's borderland regions with China, India and Thailand. This region has long been the epicenter of Asia's illegal drug production of opium, heroin and methamphetamines. This region has also experienced rising levels of drug use and drug-related harm since the 1990s, especially in Kachin State linked to injecting heroin use. And the proliferation of drugs and worsening drug-related harms have become major concerns of borderland populations since at least the 1990s. And yet one of the key challenges in Myanmar, which Charles alluded to at the end of his talk, was that despite the fact that drug issues are of huge concern for borderland populations, there's been very limited policy space to address drug issues in Myanmar's peace process since 2011. And I want to focus on why has this been the case. The first point I want to draw attention to is the fact that the drug trade is deeply embedded in unresolved contests surrounding systems of political authority in borderland regions. Myanmar's borderlands have never been under the firm control of the state, and ongoing processes of state formation underlie these long-standing borderland armed conflicts and contestations around the very nature of the state and modes of power sharing. Myanmar's army has long viewed itself as the protector of a country prone to fragmentation and internal crisis, and within this skewed state-building ideology, the army has consistently sought to gradually extend its authority and control over contested borderland areas and pick off weaker armed groups rather than pursue political dialogue. This has created huge distrust in negotiations or formal discussions, and also a context in which military might, in the form of guns and territory, is the key to doing politics. And as a result of that, revenue from drugs has been an essential part of how parties on all sides of the conflict seek to navigate the political environment that has been created by this state-building agenda. And this has created a highly permissive environment surrounding drugs. And this became especially clear under the previous round of ceasefires dating back to the late 1980s and 1990s, upon which Myanmar's recent peace process was based. Within these ceasefires, drugs became a part of informal political settlements. Negotiations around the drug trade in terms of who had the right to be involved and with what levels of protection and impunity became an important part of the informal deals that surrounded ceasefire negotiations. Drugs also became central to the army's own ongoing counterinsurgency strategies and its attempts to open up borderland regions for greater resource extraction. Most importantly, the army facilitated the expansion of a vast number of local militias to govern contested areas and to take on the risks and rigors of everyday rule. Some of these organizations have become very powerful, with hundreds and in some cases thousands of armed men and extensive business interests, including the drug trade. But it's also important to emphasize that in the political climate I briefly highlighted, that many of these militias have themselves looked to the drug trade and other illegal activities as a way to strengthen themselves, in the hope that such a show of strength would ensure that the army continues to work through them rather than move against them in the future when they no longer become useful. The other key aspect that becomes very clear from our research is how deeply embedded drugs are in the DNA of the state. That the official status of drugs as illegal has often been used by those in positions of authority in borderland areas as a way to generate small-scale protection rackets. And these off-budget revenue streams have become instrumental to covering the costs of underfunded local authorities and opportunities to accumulate private wealth, especially within the police, the prison system, even village headmen and the civil service. On top of these dynamics, it's also important to understand that the power relations that underpinned Myanmar's peace process meant there was very limited scope to address drug issues. From the Myanmar Army's perspective, the peace process was really a means to enforce compliance, not to enter into genuine political dialogue. By the late 2000s, the military government's increasing control over the country's borderlands, the country's improved financial position, and the promulgation of the 2008 constitution that enshrined military control meant that military elites were now in a position of strength, that they felt strong enough to instigate civilian rule or a transition towards civilian rule, and to capitalize on the international support that such a process would bring them. And it was underpinned by a belief that they could manage this process on their own terms. However, for those living in Kachin State and Northern Shan State, there was deep distrust of government promises of ceasefires, peace and development. Past promises of political dialogue under the previous ceasefire arrangements had never materialized. Instead, they were confronted by a military-controlled constitution and renewed offensives by the army against those organizations that refused to be converted into border guard forces under Myanmar army oversight. So for many, the beginning of the peace process from a borderland perspective was coming at a moment of crisis in the previous system of ceasefires and a growing distrust in promises of political dialogue and discussion. So what did this mean for engaging with drug issues in the peace process? Firstly, it meant there was very limited space to engage in what was a highly contentious, controversial and sensitive issue. Drugs are part of how the army operates in these areas and is thus a highly sensitive issue. And within a peace process where the army was able to draw clear red lines around what was on or off the table for discussion, it meant that it was very difficult to open up discussions around drugs. And this emphasized to borderland populations a very clear disconnect between the formal peace process and realities on the ground. It also became very clear that the drug trade remained key to how armed actors navigated the ongoing armed conflict amidst the peace process. There was very little trust in the peace process, epitomized by worsening armed conflict in Kachin State and Northern Shan State. Armed actors on all sides understood the limitations of the peace process. And as a result of that, the need to generate revenue, to build forces, to continue to try to control territory and purchase arms remained as strong as ever, and the position of drugs within that hardly changed. The second part of what Karen and Jonathan asked me to reflect on is, what are the implications of this? In short, what could have been done differently? So I want to end by briefly suggesting some of the implications of the analysis that I've just tried to very briefly set up there. The first point is perhaps an obvious one and a very broad one, but the need for a much stronger borderland perspective. I think so much of the external engagement within Myanmar's process was based on the assumption that opening up political space at the center through supporting a democratic transition and Aung San Suu Kyi and the national level peace process would provide foundations for peace building and development throughout the country's borderlands. However, this approach failed to account for how the formal peace process at the center and renewed violence in the margins were intimately connected. The military's growing control over borderland areas was a key foundation for its willingness to open up to some form of transition, but that growing military consolidation provided very few foundations for inclusive peace, or that could address long-standing grievances or difficult issues such as drugs. A borderland lens would have also emphasized so clearly the need to situate the current peace process within a deeper understanding of contested and unresolved processes of state building in center borderland relations. This should have been the central narrative around which engagement was built, rather than a narrative of transition and development. I think in very practical terms, this is a cautionary tale of the need to rethink decision-making around funding amidst war to peace transitions. A very common scenario, which was highly pertinent to Myanmar, was that amidst previous periods of large-scale armed conflict, major cross-border relief programs and exile networks had been established at the margins of the state, in Myanmar's case along the Thai border. The post-2010 transition and the launch of a formal peace process led to a rush to engage at the center, the termination of many of these cross-border programs, and a subsequent major drop in funding to border-based organizations. This had a significant impact on levels of services and aid reaching conflict and drug-affected areas. And that lack of continued support and investment to those kinds of cross-border networks seems especially problematic now in light of the new reality unfolding in Myanmar. The second point is the need to understand the ways in which drugs have become embedded in the DNA of the Myanmar state itself. And this isn't a simplistic notion of a narco state. The Myanmar army is not orchestrating the drug economy. Serious transnational organized crime is the key driving force. But drugs have become embedded in the processes of counterinsurgency, state consolidation, and economic development in borderland areas, which are the same processes that are commonly assumed to be mechanisms through which illegal economies can be dismantled. When in reality, there are strong logics behind just organized crime for why the drug trade flourishes in Myanmar. Again, in practical terms, this could have been seen through emphasizing the need to engage much more with the role of army-backed militias in conflict analysis and in the peace process, when in reality they were almost completely absent from the formal peace process and discussions around it. Second, and I think this is especially important going forwards, there is perhaps a need for a stronger focus on how to address drug-related harms in a context of ongoing instability and military control, rather than focusing on ending armed conflict through a formal peace process as a way to addressing the very real everyday drug-related harms that borderland populations are experiencing. And that may also mean the need to confront the fact that in many contested borderland areas, the main service providers are cross-border networks and non-state armed groups. What scope is there to open up discussions around how to engage with such organizations to support service delivery in terms of education, training, funding around addressing drug-related harms? And I'll finish there.